Well, for more on today's big stories, I'm joined by two other Jameses, Sky News host and Daily Telegraph National Affairs Editor James Morrow and One Nation Chief of Staff James Ashby. Gentlemen, we'll try not to get confused with names here, but let's start with the ongoing fallout from the landmark NZYQ immigration detention ruling, which of course saw 140 criminal detainees released into the community late last year. Now, the federal court has been forced to convene a special panel of judges to tackle the wave of challenges that's engulfed the legal system since that ruling. James Ashby, let me go to you. There's been 25 appeals already lodged and no doubt more to come, and the Labor government still hasn't sorted out their immigration issues. The challenges range from people seeking damages for being illegally detained and people challenging ankle bracelets, curfews, and this likely could go on for a couple of years. What on earth do you make of all this?
Well, it's all costing the Australian taxpayer hundreds of millions of dollars. That's what it will cost by the time every single one of these cases have been heard. We know that litigation's not getting any cheaper, and particularly when it involves taking senior counsel, top-paid litigation specialists that are going to the High Court. It's tying our court process up, and all in the meanwhile, Australians are scratching their heads wondering how the hell Labor made such a mess of this situation. Giles has got to go, but this Prime Minister couldn't sack Payman, so we've got Buckley's chance of getting rid of Giles at this rate. It's a disaster, and Australians are deeply ashamed of what the Prime Minister has allowed to happen in this country with those people who should have been deported. They're criminals. For the most part, these people are hardcore criminals that pose a risk to all other Australians, and yet they're allowed to be released free in amongst our community under this Labor government.
Yeah, it does beg the question, what do you have to do to lose your job in the Labor Party?
Yeah.
The latest news poll out today shows promising signs for the coalition. They're pulling ahead of Labor in key battleground states, Queensland and in New South Wales. And the coalition now enjoys majority support among male voters. James Morrow, first to you. Labor's lost significant support among 18 to 34-year-olds with those demographic shifting to the Greens. Now, that was discovered before Fatima Payman left the Labor Party. Is this a worry for Labor, losing that demographic to the Greens?
Well, I think that, combined with everything else we're seeing, James McPherson, is a huge worry for the Labor Party, because if you take that in combination with everything else that is happening out there in the numbers to Labor, you see a party that is increasingly getting pulled apart by the different poles of loyalty that it has. So on the one hand, you know, Labor has reset itself in the last decade or 2 decades as the party of the big end of town. You know, it is tied closely to corporate Australia now. It is tied closely to the big super funds. It is tied closely to the big unions. It's tied, you know, closely to all those big establishment interests. On the other hand now, it's also being tied closer and closer to the Greens, to other potential minor parties that we're seeing crop up with their own sort of fringe issues out there that are going to be dragging it further and further away from that. And then now we've got this age issue here where the young vote, and especially the female vote, is sliding towards the Green. And the other interesting thing about this, too, is that within those numbers we see the male vote is shifting to the coalition, which is something that we've seen in other countries. So we've got a political divide, we've got an age divide, and we've also got a gender divide. And Labor is now caught between all of these different, you know, tugging forces on it. And it's going to be very hard to see how this becomes a mass movement party like it has tried to be in the past.
You know, James Ashby, it seems like the entire state of Queensland has fallen out of love with Labor. I mean, Brisbane has an LNP mayor. David Crisafulli looks likely to become premier in October. And now the coalition's leading the federal polls. What has Labor done to Queensland?
Well, they've quite literally, over the last, well, close to a decade now, destroyed this state. If it's not the youth crime that is making people live in fear right across towns like mine here in Keppel, right up far north, and now we're seeing people living in fear down in our major cities because these kids are just running riot across the state. But not only that, you've got a state here which is just absolutely covered in red tape because of this state government. We've seen excise the taxes, royalties in our mining sector go through the roof, which has made major corporations abandon this state. We've got ramping in our hospitals, a shortfall of nurses, at least 1,400 nurses short here. Our education department is failing because we cannot attract enough school teachers. It is decaying, and a Bruce Highway that is like a goat track. And more and more of the weeks that I spend up here in North Queensland and Central Queensland, I see the Bruce Highway close and more deaths every single day. It's not roadworthy anymore. So that's what this Labor state government have done, and that is why voters are turning to people like myself and minor parties like One Nation. So I think we're in for a change when that election comes October 26.
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right about the Bruce Highway. I've driven that road plenty of times myself, and the Labor Party have allocated $500 million for a wind farm, but delayed funding to fix up the highway. Can you believe it? I spoke in the opening about Fatima Payman, who sensationally quit the Labor Party on Thursday. Now, questions have been raised about the senator's citizenship and whether it affects her ability to remain in the Senate as an independent. Payman was granted Australian citizenship in 2005 and says she took reasonable steps to renounce her Afghan citizenship. But in 2021, the Afghanistan embassy said her request for renunciation could not be completed. James Morrow, are these valid concerns, or is Labor just playing petty political games by putting this out there?
Yeah, look, it's going to be rare for me to take Fatima Payman's side on this here, but this really does feel like a classic Labor stitch-up. You know, they're like, they would have known about this. They would have had this in their back pocket. They would have vetted her when they put her up for the Labor Party and for the Senate seat. They would have known all of this. This is now a Hail Mary play because they are furious at Payman for what she has done to them, and fair enough. But, you know, let's be real clear about this. Fatima Payman came over here, I think, in 1999, I think. So even before 9/11, the idea that, you know, the Afghan government that was there then has anything to do with the Afghan government now run by the Taliban, you know, is a bit of a nonsense. The idea that there's some sort of bureaucratic mechanism, like if you were renouncing your Italian citizenship or your Japanese citizenship or, you know, the citizenship of any other functional nation, you know, that doesn't exist here. And I think this attempt by Labor to get her on this just strikes me as really, really desperate. You know, they did the same thing to Dai Lee, with the independent who knocked out Christina Keneally in the 22 election. They tried to make this a big deal about it for her. And, of course, you know, she came over as a child from Vietnam after it had been overrun by the communists. And, you know, again, the same thing. That government didn't exist anymore. It's just Labor, I think, playing games. It's petty.
Fair call, fair call. Now, on to, of course, a friend of Senator Payman, and that is Mehreen Faruqi from the Greens. She appeared on ABC's Insiders yesterday, but spent a lot of time dodging questions over Hamas. Let me just remind you of her comments there.
Does Hamas need to be dismantled?
Well, listen, the situation with Hamas is it has nothing to do with Palestinian statehood and Palestinian self-determination.
No, the question was, does Hamas need to be dismantled?
The Palestinians need to decide where they want to go with their own region.
So if they choose Hamas, that's okay?
David, that is such, what can I say?
Do you think Hamas should be dismantled?
Hamas is listed as a terrorist organization, and there is absolutely no change that we are demanding in that.
Oh, my goodness. James Ashby, seems like a pretty straightforward answer. What do you make of that?
Well, that's why Mehreen Faruqi's no friend of One Nation's nor the rest of the country. And she certainly doesn't represent the majority of Australians who clearly identify that Hamas is a terrorist organisation. I don't know how difficult it is for the Greens Party to be able to spit that out. And here they are defending those people who climbed all over our heart of democracy in Parliament House last week and flew the Hamas symbol, the upside-down red triangle, which clearly states that they were in support of Hamas. This is a woman who should not be in that parliament with the views that she carries. I'm sorry, but the Greens are just a protest group in that parliament today. They're far from the organisation that used to love trees and love our environment. No, they stand for everything other than Australia. And I'm sorry, but that was just the poorest attempt, and it should be played far and wide in that interview to show people the Greens no longer stand for Australia.
Indeed. Well, James Ashby, James Morrow, thank you both for your time.